Hello, everybody. This is Chad.
This is Matt.
This is the Subject to Change podcast.
Hope you guys are having a great day today.
This is the inaugural episode of Subject to Change.
And we have a couple topics that we want to talk about today. The first one, though, Chad wants to broach because he thinks it's important to use as a baseline for what we want to do with the premise of this conversation piece known as a podcast. So I'll let him.
Today I want to talk about talking. I want to have a conversation about conversation.
Mm-hmm. That's kind of the big, I guess the broadest we can get, right? With the idea of having a podcast, since it's just the whole concept of a podcast is just speaking. So
right, and I thought it'll give us a better idea of what we want to do with the podcast, and I thought it would give anybody who might be listening an idea of who we are and how we're going to talk, and maybe even a little bit of the things we're going to talk about.
Okay.
So why don't we start with why we want to have conversations at all?
You want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Of course, there's lots of different kinds of conversations. Some of them are necessary. We have all kinds of little conversations throughout the day, but I think more what I'm getting at is having conversations about bigger topics, or conversations about our opinions, or conversations about our thoughts, conversations about abstract things. Mm-hmm. And I just want to say that I think the main reason I like talking about these things, well, part of me is just compelled to talk about things that I'm interested in. And
of course,
like everybody else, I want to be heard. I want people to understand me. I think that's just a normal human urge. But I really enjoy working out my thoughts through conversation.
I'm the same way.
And I think that's probably the best way for me to do that. Aside from writing is the other major way for me to do that. Mm. But even when I'm writing about something like this, I'm basically having a conversation with myself, or with an imaginary
third
person
party,
who disagrees with me.
Yeah.
And so I could say a lot more about that, but that's my main reason for wanting to have these conversations too, is to help develop my own thoughts about the things we're going to talk about.
So for you, the podcast is a way to not just disseminate some sort of information if we talk about some sort of topic, but it's also for you to build on your own belief structure, or to morph it or change it, or
and I think it's going to be much more of that than me trying to disseminate information or teach other people stuff. I mean, I'll talk about that more later.
Okay.
How about you? Tell us why you want to have conversations.
Well, like you, I'm also the same way when it comes to working things out. If I'm just stuck in my own head with an idea or a thought, it gets to a certain point and then I can't really progress. And I find that if I, especially, talking about writing, if you want to go that route, with creative writing, if there's a plot hole or some sort of part where I'm stuck, even if I just bring it up to someone and I talk to them, I talk myself through it, I can progress. And I feel like that sort of medium of changing one's thought, being able to talk and convey ideas, does help one grow. And being able to have your ideas challenged, to challenge other ideas, to kind of put your beliefs to the whetstone and make them sharper, change them, and just for me to have an opportunity to talk about the things that I enjoy, the things that I believe in, things that that I'm passionate about, that I want to express to you, Chad,
right,
and to express to any of the listeners. I've always been one. I mean, this. I'm a talker. I like to talk about big things and small things. Our conversations before we decided to record these have been very much about philosophy and, very, politics.
Yeah, social trends and current events. And
very, not general small talk things. And I think the reason, I don't know if you share this, if we want to segue into, why we decided to do this as a podcast with each other, in my eyes, is that I like the content of our conversations and the depth that we go into and the topics that we do talk about, that I felt that someone aside from the two of us might get something out of it, might get some insight, might see a side of us that they don't normally see. I know that for me, not really having an outlet for these types of in-depth conversations with a lot of different people, not a lot of people see this side of me. So, being able to have these conversations about, like you said, like social things, politics, philosophy, just in other like day-to-day things will help me change how I think or how I feel, but also kind of shine a light on those things to the outside world.
Yeah, that makes sense. That brings up a couple things, actually, that I want to talk about. The first of which, to get back to the whole teaching thing, I would love to be able to teach people things and love to say that I'm going to sit here and give people information and facts, but I don't really feel like I know enough about anything. Well, I don't know enough about the things that we're going to talk about to really do that. And so what I hope for people to get out of our conversations is more how to have a conversation, or I hope people can find it instructive to listen to the way we're having conversations and the way we are, throwing ideas back and forth and interrogating ideas, and
then be able to do it themselves.
Right. Yeah. And maybe we're not going to be great at that at the beginning, because this is kind of a new format for me, at least. I'm not used to, I'm not used to making my thoughts public like this, sharing them and not knowing who is going to listen to them. I mean, I'm used to talking to you like this, but it changes things a little bit, and I might mention that again later. But the second thing that this brings up is that you mentioned that you don't really have these conversations with other people, and that's one of the things I wanted to ask you about is, do you ever have conversations like this with other people? And by conversations like this, I mean like conversations about the sort of things that people might disagree about. Controversial things, I suppose, is one way to put it, but that's even putting too fine a point on it, maybe.
Yeah. It depends on the group that I'm with. I mean, I have a wide range of people I consider associates, friends that have different values, different views, different beliefs. Most of the time, if our views or beliefs contradict, and I know that if that contradiction was brought to light, it would cause some pain or it'd be a problem. So try not to bring that up. Like one thing, like I'm an atheist. I've been an atheist since like high school. And early on in my attempt to have conversations with people about religion, it always turned in, it always devolved into just this like spatting of negativity between both sides. More recently, though, I've been having a lot more political conversations with people online, which can also get very, negative quickly.
Yeah, that's a little bit different beast altogether.
Yeah, talking to people online and talking to people in person is obviously like two different worlds, and the whole dynamic changes. But I've had a couple political conversations in person, but those get heated very quickly. Most of these conversations, depending on the context and the people you're having them with, can get very negative very quickly. If there isn't some sort of boundary or some sort of connection between the two of you to say that this is just a conversation, it's not going to affect how we treat each other.
Yeah, which is very difficult to do.
It is.
I mean, people just... Well, for one thing, I think it's just human nature to take things like that personally.
True.
And it's you have to train yourself not to.
Or even you can take it. I mean, you can take it personally, but not to go straight into defensive mode where you start attacking the other person based off of
right,
things that aren't even really relevant. Like there was one instance like online where someone was talking about evolution incorrectly after the Bill Nye debate with
Ken Ham.
Yeah, with Ken Ham. A religious person posted something online about evolution, and they were incorrect. And I said I wasn't being negative. I just called them ignorant. and that's not a slur or anything. Ignorant just means you don't know something about what you're trying to talk about or about something.
Right.
But every single person who responded to me in that thread said, why do you call her stupid? Why are you being so mean? And I'm like, stupidity and ignorance are not the same thing.
Right.
You're ignorant about ignorance in that instance.
Right, exactly.
So, those kinds of situations where they thought I was taking her intelligence into account, like she couldn't learn.
Right. Yeah.
Completely devolved that conversation.
And that has something to do with the connotation of that word too. But
exactly.
We could get into that. But I'm interested in knowing when you kind of detect that you're in one of these sort of conversations with somebody in your life and you get to that point where you feel like things could get heated, do you just back off?
It depends. If it's in person and there really is if there's nothing to gain from the conversation and like things are just going to devolve and it's going to be negative, then I try not to get in that position in the first place. Right. I kind of follow the human resources rule of these things. You don't talk about religion, politics, or whatever at work.
Yeah.
Just don't talk about it in general, which is kind of the problem we might get into, like people not talking about these things because they are so touchy.
Yeah.
But online, since there is that level of anonymity, even if it is on Facebook where it is you talking to someone else and you know who they are.
Right. You're still not face to face with them.
Yeah. And having that barrier of, the keyboard and the screen and the page and everything, you can, I've gotten to way more heated arguments online than I've ever done in real life.
Yeah.
When it comes to these sort of things.
I've had some of those too. And we could get into those if we wanted to, but I do find, I'll admit that there are conversations that are easier online. So, there are advantages to having a conversation online because you can take your time to respond and things like that. But for the most part, personally, I've stopped having those conversations online. It's just too difficult without having tone of voice and facial expressions and all that stuff. When you're talking about something that you disagree about, it works better in my experience if you're with the person and they can be reassured that you are their friend and that you're not insulting them. There's just too much information that goes missing in online conversations. And I mean, in conversation with strangers, I just almost have never even messed with that, even though there have been times when I've wanted to. There's been times when I've wanted to talk about things and I don't have anybody to talk to them about. So I've thought about going onto some subreddit or something and starting conversations. But the few times I've done that, it hasn't been fruitful enough for me to want to do it in the future. Yeah. And I haven't had terrible experiences with it, but it just hasn't been that great.
Yeah, and kind of to backtrack a little. Well, I mean, there's a point that I want to make. Let me make that point now. If you do go online and you seek out those kind of conversations, that kind of leads to these echo chambers and stuff that we find too. And people can't, let's say you're the only Democrat in a really red family. You can't really talk about what you believe or how you feel, or the inverse is also true. So you look for validation or some sort of support online, and then that kind of leads down the path of, these echo chambers where these people fall into, they inoculate themselves from the opposite of what they believe in, and they never have to face it again unless it's some sort of dire situation, and then they always react defensively and they attack on both sides.
Right.
But the other part of this, what I wanted to say about having conversations with people, it's not always about things that I would consider controversial that I don't have conversations with. It's also things that are considered, like people consider too deep or too intellectual, or too, they gotta, where people have to think, or they might not have an opinion. Like I have gotten more into philosophy the past handful of years, and there aren't a lot of people I know who are versed in philosophical thought.
Yeah.
And trying to have those conversations with just anybody, it usually turns out, I don't know much about that, or I don't have an opinion about that, or what have you. And that's kind of not really frustrating. It's upsetting because I get a lot of value out of those conversations, talking and thinking about, life and time and the nature of humanity and all these like really quote unquote deep thought things.
Yeah.
Where, you know, a lot of people don't think about or talk about those things. And that's another thing that, you know, I get out of this relationship that I don't get from a lot of other people.
I know exactly what you're talking about. I get the same thing too. And I actually, there's a couple things I want to say about this. One, it's hard to blame people for not wanting to have these conversations because a lot of the time there's very little for them to gain.
True.
Especially from their perspective. They don't know where you're going with it. They don't know if you're trying to pull some gotcha thing with them. They don't know if you're going to try to make them look stupid. Mm-hmm. You know, for the most part, the most likely outcome in a lot of those situations is that you're going to like each other less, or at least that's what they think.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to blame people. But the other thing I want to say is that I think people sell themselves a little bit short on that stuff too. You know, I know that we like to talk about, quote unquote, deep or abstract topics, but I think most people have opinions about those, and I think most people can actually speak about them intelligently if you let them, and if they're in a position where they don't think that you're just going to pull some maneuver on them to make them look stupid or to, you know, to make you look good or whatever. Because I don't know about you, but I feel like the so-called abstract things that I'm interested in, I feel like they're actually very practical. You know, if there's something that's so abstract that it doesn't affect my life, I'm not really interested in it. Like, I'm interested in abstract or deep things, but only insofar as they affect me and affect people, the world, and people I care about. And I think that most people actually do have opinions about them, even if they say they don't.
Yeah, I think the same thing too. And I try to, I mean, this kind of goes back to, when you're talking about the gotcha things, this kind of goes back to the early wave of new atheism. You know, like the atheists would always talk about, oh, I want to have a debate and I want to talk about this. And, you know, it's all intellectual. But then once they get the theologian in the conversation, it's all a bunch of got you on this, got you on that. And it's not really, you know, it's not fair. It's pretty disingenuous. And that's not, you know, I used to engage in that sort of thing too. But now I'm more interested in just learning new perspectives, because maybe my perspective on something like, you know, the human condition, say, is starkly different from someone else's, and I'm just interested in their perspective on what I think about a lot. And they might not think about it that much, because, you know, there's like a lot of people that, like, if you think about that thing too much, you'll just go crazy.
Right.
They're not wrong.
No,
like, there's a lot of things.
I'm glad you said that, because I actually agree. There is such a thing as thinking about stuff too much.
Yeah. And, you know, sometimes like, this is going to come off sounding really douchey, but sometimes I wish I didn't think about certain things too much. That I could just turn off, like, don't think about that.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I don't think that sounds douchey. I very much agree with that. Yeah, we can get into that at some point. I actually have some things to say about that. But if I can back up for a second.
Sure.
Talking about having these kind of conversations with people in real life, it took me a long time to realize that people don't want to have these conversations. And I've made a lot of mistakes just assuming that other people were willing and able to have conversations about even just, you know, political stuff. And I've personally changed a lot over the last several years in the way I handle those things. And at this point, like you, I do tend to back away. And actually, I tend to not have those conversations with people for the most part.
Yeah.
And when I do have them, I tend to focus on just trying to understand where they're coming from. And I know what I think for the most part. You know, I do like to talk in order to work things out, but there's a lot of things that I have already worked out. And there's not much use in just berating somebody with what I think I know. And
yeah, because that just leads to fighting.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. And I think I used to try to I used to be very interested in changing people's minds in a conversation like that, in a debate type conversation. But now I'm almost never interested in changing somebody's mind. What about you? Do you, when you're having a conversation about something where you disagree with somebody, are you trying to persuade them?
I think I do have more of the persuasive bug in me.
Yeah.
Where I get to a point where, maybe it's proselytizing or what, I believe in something so much that I want to present it to someone else and I want to convince them and get them on the same page with me. The perfect example of this is, the 2015 presidential race before the Democratic nominee was selected. So when it was still up between Hillary and Bernie, it's very much a Bernie supporter. And, I was very much, pushing, put people in his direction,
right.
presenting them with information, persuading them on what he believes, counteracting their biases, and just very much trying to persuade them. I know that I brought a couple people over to the Bernie side, not hundreds of people, and not a huge amount, but to know that there's a couple people out there who listening to me and doing their own investigation after I brought some things up,
right,
changed their mind.
Yeah.
I don't do that all the time. I kind of made some. I helped some people kind of move away from religion early on. And I've done some persuasive things, and I if I truly believe in something, I'm more inclined to do that. But now, kind of like you, now more recently, I kind of just I'm more curious in what they believe, and if I feel like that there's an incongruity or something, then I'll kind of just test them a little bit and push them a little bit.
Yeah.
But I don't want it to get into this huge fight between the two of us, because you've been living your life, third person. You've been living your life the way you've been living it, believing what you believe, and you've made it this far. I mean, who am I to say that you're doing it wrong?
Right. Yeah. So I have to ask then: have you ever changed your mind in the middle of a conversation or because of a conversation? Has somebody ever persuaded you? Probably not in the almost nobody changes their mind in the middle of a conversation, but
not persuaded me, but I have had a couple eye-opening experiences in conversation.
Yeah. Oh, that's good to hear.
One of the most prevalent ones for me that I can bring up right now, not having thought about this very thoroughly, but the first one that comes to mind is actually the second conversation between Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris, when Jordan Peterson is talking about the Bible and talking about literary heroes.
Oh yeah.
And things like that. And when he described Jesus not as some supernatural being, but as a literary hero.
Yeah, as a meta hero.
Yeah, that really clicked with me.
Yeah.
And I'd always been anti-religion and anti-whatever for a really long time. But when he put it in those terms, it kind of flipped a switch. I'm not saying I'm a Christian now or anything.
Right.
But I can look at I can look at Christianity in a different way, instead of just seeing it as a mind disease or whatever.
Yeah.
I can see it, people actually believe in this, and they want to emulate the things that they see in it, good and bad.
Yeah.
And to think of it from that perspective as someone who does write and who makes characters and wants to make them seem real and relevant and worthy of people's affection, having him put it in those terms definitely changed my perspective. It didn't change what I believe or don't believe.
Yeah.
But it changed my perspective.
Yeah, I remember actually. I think you told me immediately after you saw that I think you told me that you changed your mind about that. Mm-hmm. I guess to answer my own question, I can't think of anything specifically where I was in the middle of a conversation or right after a conversation. For me, I think it works the way it probably does with most people, where we have a disagreement. I think I'm right about it. We hash it out between us. And then afterwards, I start to think, well, Matt made some good points about that.
Yeah.
And then maybe I have another conversation with somebody else, and they make the same points, or they make some supporting points, and I think, oh yeah, there really is something that I've never seen here before, and I think about it some more. Maybe I read a book about it. Maybe I listen to a podcast or a lecture or something about it, and then eventually I change my mind. And that's happened with many, many, many things. That's happened with virtually everything that I currently believe.
Your level of malleability and plasticity of mind tells you how long it'll take for you to change and to grow and to take on some new ideas as your own. For a long time, I mean, like big things, like I've always believed in evolution as a kid, but, the idea of religion, just in general, it was always kind of this wishy-washy thing. Maybe I believe, maybe I don't. And then after a long time, it kind of just slowly grew towards non-belief. And I know that, and there's a lot of talk, if you want to talk about this in perspective of politics. People like Jordan Peterson talks about this, where there's, certain types of people, how they think puts them more, aligns them more with certain ideologies from the outset. So,
based on their personality.
Yeah, based on their personality. So if you're more, naturally egalitarian, then you're going to be more liberal. If you're naturally more conscientious, you're going to be more conservative. Those sorts of things that are just ingrained in your personality are going to lead you down towards certain lanes of ideology and thought and beliefs in the long run. Now, who's to say you can't change some fundamental cores of how you believe, what you believe, based on your experiences and conversations you have with other people. But like I said at the very beginning, is that all comes down to the malleability. If you're someone who isn't very malleable, someone like who's very stubborn or begrudging with what they believe and what they think, then they're going to be far less likely to come into new information or a new perspective and then let that perspective shape their own perspective.
Which is itself a personality trait, or a collection of personality traits, which probably predicts which side of the political spectrum you lean toward also. I'm actually I'm very interested in that personality kind of research. Jonathan Haidt has also done a bunch of really interesting stuff about that. And we'll probably talk about that at some. I know we're going to talk about this at some point in a podcast, because I'm very interested in. I have a lot to say about personality and how it
colors the world.
That's probably a good way to put it. But personality and how it relates to your political disposition and things like that. I think it's very interesting. And it helps make sense of a lot of things that otherwise don't make a lot of sense. Maybe this is a good time to bring up something else that I've been thinking about. You can just tell me what you think about this, but I was thinking about the idea of labels. We all have our political and our philosophical and our social labels that we use. Liberal, conservative, atheist, Christian,
cuck.
I suppose. Although very few. Well,
I'll bleep that.
There are people who identify as that. People with that fetish, but
kinky.
For the most part, that's an insult. But there's many of these, and they are very useful when we're talking in general terms. I mean, we're going to say all kinds of things in this podcast about liberals tend to do this or believe this, and conservatives tend to think this, and those are very useful. You probably can't even have these conversations without using those terms. Right. But when it comes down to individual people and individual ideas and individual issues, I think that using those labels causes more problems than they solve, because people start arguing about what the labels mean. And so I was wondering what you think about trying not to label ourselves. Well, you already have a couple times. So what about me? What do you think about if I try very hard in this podcast not to give myself those labels?
What do I think about you trying to do that?
Yeah. Do you think that's a good idea, or do you think it's better to be transparent about that?
Well, I think the you kind of touched upon this, but the point of labels for human thought and human conversation is to boil things down to make things easy.
Yes.
if you go into a conversation with someone you don't know, you've never met, your brain, an animal instinct of your brain is to start categorizing.
Yeah.
To put you, whoever you are with, into certain categories to see if those categories align with your categories.
Yeah. Well, and it's useful. It is
useful.
Not an entirely bad thing.
No. Yeah, it's very. It goes back to ancient instincts when it comes to who's a threat, who's family, who is going to be beneficial, who's going to be negative.
Right.
Now, that kind of instinctual, ingrained thinking of categorizing and generalizing is going to stick with us until we can, find the gene that does that and take it out with CRISPR. But
for better or for worse.
The use of labels is definitely a double-edged sword because if you go into, and I think it usually comes down to if the label that you find out about someone is counter to your own. Like if I go as a more liberal leaning person, I don't call myself a liberal. I don't use that label because, liberal is kind of derogatory, just like how conservatives derogatory now.
Right.
But if I go into a setting and I'm curious if I fit in or not, I'd like to know certain labels. If I'm in a room full of other liberals, them being liberal or not won't really matter. We'll get to that level of sameness and that'll drop off. Kind of like how, this is kind of counterintuitive because with atheism that didn't really happen because that was kind of like the glue in the beginning of that, like the new atheism. But we'll come back to that conversation another day. But the point of having a label in the first place, saying that you are a part of group A or group B based on certain beliefs, makes things quick in a first meeting. Now, let's say I'm a liberal and I go into a predominantly conservative room. As soon as I let out that I am that and they tell me that I am, there's like an instinctual defense mechanism that goes up. Like, we don't believe in the same thing. We're in different camps. We can't talk. Yeah. And then that level of difference becomes the barrier. We only see each other as that label.
Yeah.
Now, again, that can be positive or negative. But then when you go down to the individual, like I'm talking about going into a room full of maybe 10 people, where there's like the group of them and me as the individual. Now, if it's me going up with, going and talking to one specific person, I want to know based off, we can't have, most people you can't have an hour-long conversation with most of the time. When you meet someone new, you have to kind of figure out where they fall in your own groups, and like if they're adversarial, if they're an ally, what have you. So people usually have some general questions. Some people are really straight out with it, but other people are kind of like, they kind of beat around the bush with how they talk to try and like eke out some information from you. They might ask about a certain cultural topic, or they might try and bring something up, or just based on how you look, just make assumptions and then go from there. And I think that the whole use of labels is very human, but when we don't take the conversation beyond that first level, that's when things break down. When two people see each other as adversarial, like conservative, liberal, and leave it there instead of breaking it down and saying, well, that's one thing that they believe. They're also, it's dehumanizing in a way, because people forget that both conservatives and liberals care about their families. Both conservatives and liberals care about their community. Yeah. They care about very normal things, but on that one level of labeling, there's a difference.
Yeah. I really like what you said about, I think that you said that labels exist to make thinking and talking easier. And so I think that they cease to be useful exactly when they start making things less easy and more complex.
Yep.
But I actually think this problem might be slightly worse than you think it is, because I think that the problem exists if I'm a liberal in a room. Okay, so if I'm a liberal and I go talk to a bunch of conservatives and I kind of start things off by saying, hey guys, I'm a liberal. They have all these they have a bunch of ideas about what a liberal believes.
Yes.
Some of them are correct. Some of them are not. Some of them are correct as far as the average liberal goes, but that maybe it's not correct for me.
Mm-hmm.
And then, not only that, but also what I always end up see happening is that people start arguing about the labels and what it means to be liberal. And so, I'll say I'm a liberal and I believe
the no true Scotsman.
Yeah, that's part of it. Yeah, I'll say I'm a liberal and I believe this, and then somebody's going to say, well, that's not a liberal belief, that's a conservative belief, because what they've done is in their mind, all the bad beliefs are liberal and all the good ones are conservative, and vice versa. This happens exactly, the exact mirror image of this happens, and so it's unhelpful when you're a liberal talking to a bunch of conservatives. But I actually think that it's almost as unhelpful if I'm a liberal talking to a bunch of other liberals.
Really?
Because
I was gonna jump in and say, well, when you're meeting your own group, once they know that you're on the same playing field, that one layer drops off.
That's true.
And then you can start digging deeper into other things. And I was gonna say that, let's say two liberals meet and say, I'm a liberal. Oh, I'm a liberal too.
Yeah.
And then they start talking about those differences between each other so they can weed it down to what type of liberal they are.
Yeah, you're probably right that it kind of breaks down some barriers and makes conversation easier. But what I was going to say is that liberals also have a conception of what a liberal is.
True.
So if I walk into a room with a bunch of other liberals and I say that I'm a liberal, they're going to say, oh, cool, so are we. We have just assumed, they have just assumed that I think the way that they do. Well, we might even be less likely to talk about stuff because they assume that I agree with them because we've used the same label for ourselves.
Well, in some regards, you do in that instance believe the same things to a point, but then this is where I mean that where it can dig into other layers and get to different labels, which is another thing too. Is that's when I meet someone new, no one has ever said I'm a liberal, I'm a conservative.
Well, I don't do that either,
just for the sake of the conversation. We've been saying that, but you can, based off of other things that they say, these breadcrumbs.
Yeah.
You can figure out where on the spectrum they more lean to. You could say, oh, well, a Trump supporter thinks like this, or, a Hillary supporter thinks like this. And, that's kind of like the negative connotation. But usually, like, kind of back to that personality thing, if you meet someone irregardless of the context of politics, if you meet them in certain circumstances, you can probably guess how they think based off more generalizations that have been used that are attached to those labels. Because, I was talking about before, that the labels make conversation easy. Instead of, it makes it easy because it makes labels make things easy because they make the conversation. You can broach things easier once you find a common ground. Like when you can find some sort of commonality, then you can start talking about other things. Like when we met, I didn't know your politics, you didn't know mine. Mm-hmm. But through different conversations and just the nature of our conversations in general, we learned over time and, that we kind of align very closely on certain things. We found out last week that we don't completely align like we feared for a long time because, conversations get really boring if you believe all the same things.
Oh, yeah. I would be worried if we believed all the same things.
And I'm sure there are some labels. I know there are some labels that you put on yourself or that are attributed to you that aren't attributed to me that I can't relate to. And it's not, related to your outdoorsmanship. You're an outdoorsman. Yeah. I am not. That's one label that we don't share, so we can't have a commonality there. But we do have a commonality when it comes to, the types of books we read, or the type of people we listen to when they talk, or certain things like that. So there's layers to the labels where you can find commonalities with other people, and it just makes it easier to decide with a list of labels. It makes it easier if you want to make a relationship with that person.
Yeah.
You know.
Yeah. So with all that said, what do you think about it? Do you think it's a good idea for me to try not to label myself on the podcast?
I think it's good not to label yourself. Yes. I think you can like I said, in conversations, most of the time, people don't express their own labels, except for like vegans, you know.
Oh yeah, not right off the bat, but I do think that once you start talking about stuff, a lot of people, it's very tempting to do as a shorthand.
Well, that's why
because you don't feel like explaining all your beliefs.
That's why I said earlier is that I lean more liberal, but I don't call myself a liberal.
Yeah, that's fair enough.
And that's and like about being an atheist too. Is like I don't ever call myself an atheist because that doesn't, in that context, that word doesn't tell you anything about any positive of what I believe.
Oh, right, in. For sure.
Since that is just negating belief in religion.
Yeah.
But in any instance, I don't ever really overtly put that stuff out with the label. Like I'll talk about certain things and then people can kind of pick up on, maybe he believes in this or maybe he believes in that. And if the context calls for it, then I would say something like, if you ask me a very pointed question, like where do you lean politically?
Yeah.
Or, if you ask a question that the answer is generally a label, then that's just going to happen. But I think if you just try and just speak truthfully to what you believe, you won't have, and since this is going to be long form anyway, you won't have to worry about ascribing any labels to yourself that you wouldn't want to in any other general context, because you don't want to make things too easy for everyone, because it's not like we're passing people on the street and just have to say, I'm Pisces, liberal, vegan, who likes cats. Yeah. And which I am none of those, but I'm not none of those. I am a Pisces, but I don't believe in astrology.
I kind of brought this up because I know that at some point it's going to be tempting for me to say, well, as a something or other, or I'm a this, and this is what I think.
I guess just how pretentious you want to sound.
But, well, maybe that too.
As a scholarly person.
But I'm going to try very hard not to do that. We'll see how it goes. I have a feeling at some point I'm going to end up saying it.
No, I mean, I've said it a couple times in this conversation because the context was relevant.
Yeah.
If we had just started with just like, I'm Chad and I'm a liberal.
Yeah.
Is that part of the shtick?
Right.
Are we just trying to push away any conservative thinkers
at
all?
And that's what I don't want to do. I don't want to color people's perceptions of the things I'm going to say based upon their own assumptions.
Misconceptions.
Misconceptions, or, they don't even have to be misconceptions. They could have a perfectly reasonable idea of what a conservative is, for example. And if I called myself a conservative, and then they could still be wrong about what I think. Because most people are a mix of views, and I think I am. Yeah. I think I am for sure. Yeah. That's not to label myself or anything. But what the other thing I wanted to say about that is I might say what I'm not at times.
Yeah.
I do feel think that might be more useful to do.
Well, I'm not a liberal. Well, what do you mean?
Yeah.
Like I'm not a conservative.
Well, despite the fact that we just talked about labels for 15 minutes, we'll try not to get too bogged down in labels in our conversations.
Yeah, but I feel like as human beings that's going to happen.
Yeah, yeah, it is. I mostly just want to avoid the assumptions, and I want to avoid those stupid arguments about what the labels mean, because they're so pointless and they detract from what the actual issue is. And
I got into a lot of arguments about that. No true Scotsman fallacy when it comes to Christianity.
Oh yeah, you can do that with anything. Yeah, it's just infuriating to me.
Where you bring up a gotcha, like, you believe this, and he's like, well, no, not Christians actually don't believe that, and then another group says, well, actually, you have to da da da, and that's why the schism happened, and then there are so many different Protestant offshoots.
Yeah,
but not to talk about religion.
This is probably just one of those eternal problems in human civilization.
Well, even okay. If we still want to stay on this label thing for a second, me bringing up Protestant, and then if I say out a couple, Protestant denominations like Methodist or Baptist or Presbyterian, those labels, which are names of groups also have their own connotations. Like,
Right.
you know, if people hear those things, you know, some people, if there's any sort of label or word in that context that makes a person go, oh my God, it's them. You know,
you're right.
That's the situation we're talking about.
Yeah, that's what I'm trying to avoid.
You know, we're trying to avoid you scoffing just based on a perceived label.
Right, and you tuning out, because that's what people do. That not another Methodist.
Yeah.
And
Not a Mormon.
Yeah, and then they just tune out and they don't listen to anything you say. But I think that's probably enough said about that.
Sure.
For the moment. But what else you got? Do you want about? I know you said you had a second thing to bring up, but anything else you want to say about conversation?
No. In related to podcasts in general and putting one's own thoughts out on the web, there's always a fear that you're gonna make a flub.
Yeah.
That you're gonna say something that's not politically kosher, that can get you in hot water and things like that. And I'm not a free speech, what is it called?
Proponent or opponent?
No.
Absolutist?
Absolutist, that's the word. In a way, I mean, I was actually thinking about free speech in general, since we were going to talk about conversations, and what, you know, since free speech is such a cornerstone of America, you know, and what in the Constitution and the Bill of Rights and how we go about conversations in the general discourse, free speech comes up a lot.
Yes.
And I think people don't understand what that means in its context. Free speech in the Constitution lays out that you can't be prosecuted or like held in contempt based on what you say. But that doesn't mean, like, by the government.
Right.
But that doesn't mean that you can't be held in contempt by your peers.
Right.
Based off of what you say. Right. So if you say something shitty and people call you out on it, you can't respond with, "Oh, my free speech." No. You can say whatever you want in that context, but that doesn't mean you're not going to have to deal with the consequences of what you say.
Yeah.
And I think that we, as people who don't generally talk about, like, I don't want to say non-controversial things, but aren't, I don't want to shoehorn how we think and whatever, but like the whole hate speech thing.
Mm-hmm.
But we have to be conscious of those consequences ourselves. And I think other people don't really understand that they might not get arrested for saying something.
Right.
Except for like bomb or fire in a theater or
right.
whatever.
Which
those like
case.
Four things,
Yeah.
those specific cases. But in general, that doesn't mean you're not going to be held accountable for what you say. And I know that me and Chad, we're going to be held accountable for what we say.
Right.
In this context. And I just want us to be conscious of that. And I want people out there to be conscious that we aren't trying to whitewash what we say.
Mm-hmm.
Or, you know, censor ourselves in general. But, you know, that we are conscious of that framework of how society works. And that we can talk about these quote-unquote deep, controversial, intellectual, what have you things, but that we also have to, like I said, be conscious of the consequences, what we say. I mean, this is a great example. Being conscious of what you say in the societal view. Not to say that anyone is even going to listen to this, but the perception right now in the political discourse is that certain people can get away with saying whatever they want and they don't have to deal with the consequences of what they say.
Mm-hmm.
And that's not how society should be. You shouldn't be able to get away with what you say if it does cause harm. And I just wanted to bring that up since people don't really think about free speech in that context. They always say, oh, I can say whatever I want. It's in the Constitution, free speech. But they don't think about the consequences of their speech.
Yeah. Okay. This is we should probably have. Maybe we should have an entire podcast about this.
And we can't.
And not to get too much into it, and also not to get too close to labeling myself, but I think I might be a little more of a free speech guy than you are. I don't entirely agree with the way... I mean, it's hard to say because I don't know, without getting into specifics. But I am a little bit wary of the consequences thing, mostly because I've seen too many cases where somebody has used the excuse that just because you have free speech doesn't mean that you are free from consequences. I've seen too many people use that as an excuse to censor, deplatform, publicly shame, anything like that, which I would say is also an irresponsible use of free speech. But in general terms, I do. Just because you have the right to free speech doesn't mean that you're not responsible for what you say.
Yeah.
I will say that. And we could get into how I think that free speech is not only a law, it's not only something that's enshrined in legislation, but it's also a value that people should have, and that the more freely we can speak, the better, and we could get into that harm thing too. I think that's an interesting topic to get into.
I agree.
But we should probably save that for a different podcast because there's a lot we could say about that. And but I think what you were trying to say is that we're going to try to be honest and we're going to speak clearly. And if we say things that people don't like, it's not meant to hurt people's feelings on purpose. It's just because we're trying to speak as honestly as we can. And
yes.
And yeah, and I don't think anybody should be afraid to do that, which is part of the reason why I am afraid of free speech doesn't mean you're free from consequences, because somebody's going to listen to what we say and say, well, my feelings are hurt, so you shouldn't be allowed to say that.
Yeah. And I think that I mean, I've been bringing up Jordan Peterson a lot recently, and I haven't been listening to him a lot these past couple months. This is mostly based on his previous forays into the public spotlight.
Yeah.
But when he talks about, being able to say what he needs to say so that there can be a conversation about certain things and not letting people's perceived offenses stop him from talking, I think that's a different level of dealing with consequences. Saying racist rhetoric does not or should have different consequences than just saying something that makes you uncomfortable.
True. The problem is that at this point we can't agree on what's racist and what's not.
Yeah.
And man, if you want to, don't listen to me about free speech. I think Jordan Peterson is the best speaker on free speech that I've ever heard. So,
I mean, that's why I brought, we talk about conversations. I've been bringing him up this entire time.
Right.
His viewpoints and his, take on speech and the ability to have conversations has definitely shaped my view on that entire... I mean, it's something I haven't really thought about.
Yeah.
That's one of those things that, without it being brought up, I never really thought about it before.
Yeah, and the stuff that he said, and I've heard other people say this too, stuff that free speech just isn't just another right. It's like a foundational right, or it's a foundational piece of a decent society.
Yeah.
And I very much agree with that.
Yeah, because when you stifle the ability to speak freely, that leads to tyranny.
Right. And no, I'm gonna save the other things that I had to say about that for later. I do think there's at least one more thing I wanted to say really quick about conversation, though, which is that one of the reasons that I want to have these conversations with you is because I want to find out what we disagree about. And weirdly enough, you wouldn't think this would be true, but I think it's really difficult to know where and why you disagree with somebody about something. Like, that you think that you disagree, and sometimes you don't even disagree. But we might kind of sense that there's a disagreement between us about something, but it's really hard to nail down exactly what it is. And I think that's because a lot of times our disagreements go down to our fundamental assumptions about the world.
Yeah.
And our fundamental assumptions about the world are things that we don't think about.
No.
Like almost by definition. If it's a fundamental assumption, it's something that's just operating under the surface and you don't think about it. And so I would like to, if it's okay with you in these conversations, to try to delve down into those fundamental assumptions about things and try to figure out where we really disagree about.
Yeah.
I think that's...
I agree.
I mean, I don't think I've ever had a conversation with somebody where we've gotten down to a real fine-grained point of disagreement about something. Yeah. It always devolves into name-calling and people getting their feelings hurt.
Well, you're just a liberal, so...
Right. Because it's very difficult, and I don't blame people for not wanting to go there. Plus, it's upsetting. I mean, people don't want to mess around with their fundamental assumptions about the world.
Yeah, well, you picked a good candidate for that because I've done that a lot for myself. Just try to through introspection and trying to dig down to find the roots of oneself.
Yeah.
It's a scary road to go down because you test your own assumptions on existence.
Yeah.
If you go down deep enough.
Yeah, and that's we're going to talk about reading at some point too, but that's a big part of my reading is challenging my basic assumptions about the world. And I've read books that made me feel like my entire psyche was being torn apart and put back together again because they made me question my fundamental assumptions. And it's very uncomfortable, it's not pleasant, and I don't blame anybody for not wanting to do it. No. But I want to do it.
But yeah, no, I'm definitely intrigued by that proposition because one thing that I've actually, I brought this up a lot in our conversations over the years is that I want to find something we disagree about. Well, I really do because it would make the dynamic of our friendship that much better, because if we generally, not even like concretely to agree on everything, but if we generally agree on everything, there's really no room for growth.
Yeah.
We can't really bring up anything new for each other to like bounce off of or to break down or to, or to build on. It's when you like, this is I'm kind of going back to the label thing, but when you hit that level of commonality on so many things, if you don't have some sort of way to break that up or build upon it, then it gets stale. I mean, that kind of, not to say that our friendship has ever gotten stale, because this idea of conversation has always been a cornerstone of our friendship, and makes that's like one of the biggest pieces, I think. But trying to find some way that we can build upon that and finding an actual difference, I think would definitely be beneficial.
Yeah, we should find some kind of test case and try it out. I have some ideas about that, actually.
Okay. Is there any other pieces of conversation that you wanted to bring up?
I just had something else, but it slipped my mind.
Wow.
I'm sure I'll think of it again later.
Okay. Well, I didn't have anything else. Since this was kind of your baby, you wanted to bring up the proposition of a conversation about conversations. I think we hit a lot of good things.
Yeah, I think so too.
I think we hit, you bringing up labels, I think was something that I would have completely passed over. Mm-hmm. But it is something that's important, especially when you're trying to talk about things that are either maligned or have their own base assumptions about them just based on the topic. Certain topics kind of have that scoff, like, they're talking about this X,
And I'll admit that I feel that way about some things.
Yeah.
I know what I was going to say, though. I was going to say that I respect somebody that I can have disagreements with and still be friends with them. I have... there's a kind of respect that I have for somebody like that I don't have with somebody who I would just never talk about anything that we disagree with about. It's kind of a test of friendship.
Yeah.
A test of any relationship, really. Friendship, romantic relationship, family relationship. It's kind of a test of that, I think.
Yeah, because you get to connect on a deeper level, even if there's a disagreement, there's still a connection.
Yeah.
The fact that you went that far and you discussed it in a healthy way. Right. People get in arguments all the time and it's negative, but if you can find something that you disagree with a friend about or what have you, some other relationship, then, and you talk about them truthfully, then you can get a new level of connection with them. Then you get with someone you don't ever try to talk to about anything.
Yeah.
You got some people that you have in your life that are very just surface level.
Right.
Small talk. How was your weekend? Blah, blah, blah. which those are fine.
And it's fine, yeah.
And there's nothing wrong
I don't
with
wanna,
with having friends where you just shoot the shit.
right. I wouldn't want to belittle that either.
Because
you need. I wouldn't want to have deep conversations.
I was
with
about to
everybody
have the same thing.
I only want to do this with a couple people in my life.
a couple people, a couple times a week.
Yeah.
Not even all the time. I listen to a lot of political stuff recently, and it can burn you out quick if you don't have the right faculty for it.
There's a lot I could say about that too. That's almost a different thing, but yeah. But even in just to tie it back to face-to-face regular conversations like this one, there's a point at which I get tired.
Yeah,
and I'm
just physically tired.
And I'm just not. I just don't think clearly anymore.
Physically
and
and mentally tired.
You have to stop these conversations at some point.
Yeah,
it is very easy to burn yourself out on it, and if you stop before you burn yourself out, you just retain more, you learn more. It's much healthier that way.
Yeah. And on that note, I think we might be closing out this episode for today. Unless you have any closing thoughts.
No, I think that's a good place to end it.
Okay. So yeah, conversation about conversations. I don't think we have a topic for next week.
Not yet. We got some potential topics.
But we will be back with you next week. You guys have a great weekend or week, however it falls out.
Yeah, and I just want to thank anybody who might be listening, and thank you, Matt, for having the conversation.
Thank you, Chad.
You're welcome.